We are broadcasting. We are live. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. How's everybody doing today? How's the panel?
Good.
Good.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining today. We've got a lot to go through. I think it's going to be an action-packed hour here, and thanks for everybody coming. So this is a panel discussion on cybersecurity within Office 365, really looking at the Microsoft Cloud, so Azure as well. So we'll kind of talk about the scope of all of those things. And so joining me here today, just make sure my slides are moving forward. There we go. My name is Christian Buckley. I am an MVP and Regional Director based out of Salt Lake City, Utah, and the founder and CEO of CollabTalk. And joining me on the panel today are Chris Gibbons, Dux Raymond Sai, Liam, and Waldeck. And I'm going to let everybody just really quick introduce themselves. Chris, who are you? Why should we listen to you?
SharePoint Server Office Server MVP, Workforce Alliance, Security, CISSP, been in IT, computer science for 20 years, and have hacked quite a few different things.
Excellent. And Dux, the man who needs no introduction, but introduce yourself anyway.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for having me. My name is Dux Raymond Sai. I serve as the CMO of AvePoint. Work closely with regulated industries, especially governments around the world. So really excited to be a part of this and talk about cybersecurity with respect to Microsoft Cloud.
Excellent. And Liam, hello.
Hello, hello. Yes, Liam, work for Productivity, architect, MVP, and I've worked with Christian on what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, and I'll give some of that background here in a minute. And then Waldeck.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I work at Rancor, where I own Quality Tools, also an MVP. Happy to be here and to talk to you guys about security.
Excellent. And just as far as some housekeeping here, so yes, we are making the recording available. We're also going to point you at the end to where you can download the white paper, the research that is the basis for the discussion today. And so that is officially available as of today. We are also going to be tracking, all of us, the Q&A. So if you have questions throughout, I think we're going to try and answer them, get to those questions, during the discussion if they're relevant. Anything that's left over, we'll go through and we'll have kind of an open Q&A at the end, as much time as we have left. So, please, ask questions, and we'll try to keep up with those. And here's what the research report looks like. Always good to share a picture here. This is based on independent research that was conducted by my company, CollabTalk, in a partnership with the Marriott School of Management at Brigham Young University. And it was sponsored by Microsoft, AvePoint, Rancor, and Soliance. And then we had a lot of help from Tygraph with the data modeling and analysis, but also in-kind support from Redmond Magazine, Collab 365 Community, and SharePoint Fest. All right, and I always love to have that help on these projects. To give you an idea of what we were focused on with this study, so it's, we're looking at the fact that Microsoft Office 365 and Azure, they're growing. I mean, Microsoft is having a lot of success getting industry praise for everything that they're doing. And those of us that are customers on the platform and partners are aware that the rate of innovation is just incredible. And we're all every day trying to kind of catch up with what's new, what's come out, how does this impact what we're doing. Online security, it's still the #1 response when you go and ask survey respondents, what are your concerns about moving from on-prem to the cloud? It's always security #1. Now, when you dig into the detail there and start asking questions, I think we're going to be discussing that in the panel, what actually kind of falls out of that. So the goal of the research was to go in and identify really what are the issues, the challenges, and the blockers that are keeping organizations from a cybersecurity standpoint from moving into the cloud. We wanted to understand those things, measure that, and then the white paper actually provides some guidance and recommendations to help you in your planning and to help you mitigate any risks. And I always use the phrase, the real or perceived risks of moving to the cloud. Very just high level, I'm just going to share some stats just to kind of set up like the scope of the research and then we're going to get right into the panel discussion, because I know everybody's chomping at the bit to share some feedback there. So as you can see from the data here, that we had the largest portion of respondents were in the IT realm. So the people that traditionally own the space, and you have then a percentage that are in, you know, finance and the business side, or over in manufacturing, and then it kind of trailed off the long tail of other respondents. But that the majority of people that responded to this research were on the IT side of the house. Also, this is interesting. There's a survey as part of our secondary research. It's not changed, but back in 2015, looking at the top perceived threats with cloud services, the unauthorized access, hijacking of accounts, and malicious insiders. But when you look at break down the data, you know, here's the breakdown of where breaches actually came from. And I know, you know, Liam, I mean, as you were the author of the white paper around this, any other thoughts or takeaways from this, you know, the industry saying, hey, these are the primary ways that we're seeing breaches. Here's what's actually being reported. Anything to share there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting that based on previous surveys, as I went back and looked through multiple surveys, that it's still the same problem. That we read on the news that the attacks have got more sophisticated, that they're more prevalent in all types of industries, but ultimately, all of the biggest ones are exactly the same, which basically ends up being a hijacking of an account, and the numbers stack that up. And you would think we would have fixed this by now, that there would have been technology available to us to help us mitigate this. But I thought it was quite interesting that we are still facing the exact same problems again and again and again, which I was hoping we would have got past that, yeah. But apparently not. We're still stuck in that same space.
Well, people are people, right? So right. I suspect that's why.
Yeah. It's just one last thing, and then we'll jump into the question number one here. And we were kind of talking about this before we got started broadcasting here, but you have 42% of respondents saying that they were not aware of Microsoft's security strategy. Next stat, 79% of people though saying that Microsoft security is sufficient. And there's just seems like, I don't know what it is, but it's the right thing. I'm good with it. That's an interesting stat. It's always interesting to go and look at this kind of data and slice and dice it and ask other kind of questions, pivot on responses. And that's why when you're doing this kind of research, it's not enough just to ask this question with multiple answers and give them kind of an other category. And it's also important to take a sampling of interviews to go deeper into their responses so that you can see some of the patterns and ask questions around that. And that we've got some of that data in the study as well. But I think, the final one here, 45% are proactively running security checks. That anybody concerned by that?
I mean, we should all be concerned about it, but I mean, realistically, it's the same thing I often ask people, if you're working in the SharePoint space, for example, and have done for a while, you'll know that, you should be looking at the log files to check for errors and everything else. But realistically, when you ask the cross section of SharePoint administrators or whatever else, the answer is, well, I haven't looked at them. Like, when was the last time you looked at them? Well, when there was an issue, so I think when it comes to proactiveness, that's one of the failings that we have across the board, because we either don't have the right staff to do it, or we don't have the right tools available. We don't know what the tools would be, but it's because over the past few years, security's not really been like the hot subject. And it was only until Target, until it hit the normal me and you, was when we start to see that change. I would expect that number to grow. Like, I would expect, if we did this in a year's time, sorry, Ducks, if we did this in a year's time, I would expect that to be a higher number, because people will have moved into technology platforms that now take care of some of that.
Yeah.
So one of the attendees, Ralph, brings up a good point, right? The word security. About
my great haircut, that's the point you were going to make?
That's correct.
So
the haircut.
So guys, Ralph, one of the attendees, makes a really good point, that security, the word security, is so broad and vague. I think one of the things, especially for us here in the space we work in, obviously we're focused on Office 365 and SharePoint. Really what we're talking about is a lot of the unstructured data. Certainly there's a bigger percentage now of a lot of mission critical, business critical information in unstructured data repositories, from file shares to OneDrive to email. I mean, how many people are sending email attachments of exported information of employee from their employee system, right, and send as an attachment? That right there is scary, because if somebody sent an Excel file with 20,000 names of employee information to somebody else, and that file is an attachment sitting in somebody's sent folder, that's a high target, right? So I think one of the key things when we talk about security is focus on the area where we're working in, which is Office 365, and how can we protect them, and then how can we take advantage of Microsoft technologies and capabilities that they offer today.
No, I think that's a great point, and it's insufficient to talk at such a high level about hey, look, you need to broadly go and look at these 5-10 things. Customers are looking for guidance, specific guidance to what to go and do with each of the different workloads, and I think it is a much more in-depth discussion around each one of those. I think we'll get into some of that with some of these questions. So it's unfortunate, I think, on that last point there with that last stat. And I would say that there's a failure of even reactive responses to this, because then it happens again. They go in, people go in, it's more of like, sticking a thumb in the crack in the dam rather and saying, hey, or putting some duct tape over that, rather than going and looking at the entire infrastructure and saying, hey, we need to relook at and re-architect how we're doing this activity so that we are, mitigating these future risks.
And I guess that in a part has to do with the fact that 365 evolves a lot, right? Workloads are being added to it every day, and it might be hard for folks to actually keep up with the pace and think of it like, okay, if we were to do a check, what should we check? What is for us to look at to know that we are that we don't leak data, that we are secure and safe, right? Because there are so many things across the whole board and service that you can tweak.
Yep. That, and that's a great point. And we're gonna get into talk about some of the rate of change there. And I would say that's an argument that Microsoft is trying to make about out of the box versus and I'd say, because of that high rate of change, there's actually, I would argue, more responsibility on Microsoft's shoulders to be able to provide those out-of-the-box capabilities, so that people are, as the change happens, are prepared before they understand what's actually the change that's happening, and be able to go and look at, how does this impact me elsewhere? Oh, Microsoft has already thought of this. You can't be overly reliant on that. You have to be prepared as a company, but that responsibility is getting larger, in my view, for Microsoft to be able to cover. Well, we're gonna come kind of back to that topic. So why don't we jump in with question number 1, if everybody's ready.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. So while there's been a decrease in the average cost for a lost or stolen record containing sensitive and confidential information, and this goes back, Liam, to kind of your point earlier.
Yep.
The average size of the breaches is increasing. So the cost, the impact of the per file, per artifact within that, but we're seeing that they're getting larger. So why are we seeing that trend?
So I'll take this one first. So this is one of those things where, if you think historically, that people had less data in certain storage mechanisms, a lot of it was ring fenced behind the firewall on network, which in all fairness is a much harder target to try and break into, because it's sitting behind corporate firewalls. And in all fairness, I mean, over the years, as I've looked at company environments, as companies have done penetration tests, it's actually quite complicated to just break into somebody's corporate environment and just take stuff out. It has to come from within. But over the years, the trend has been, I mean, if you go back to the beginning of SharePoint, remember when Microsoft came out and said, you need to move all of your file shares into SharePoint. That was a strategic piece of guidance that they came out with, which fundamentally was not correct. Like it shouldn't, back then that should never have happened, but people did it, and then they started shifting everything. And so we suddenly have vast amounts of data now in these cloud platforms, in on-premises solutions, because that's what we do now. We keep creating exponential amounts of data because we duplicate copies of the same spreadsheet 27 times and store it in 27 different cloud services just in case, as well as keeping the copy on the USB stick and the C drive. So we have multiple places that this information goes. And so every time there's a breach, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger because more people are signing up for services, more people are utilizing cloud services. And so it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, it's ridiculous numbers that we're seeing, you know, 300-400 million people's information gets a single breach. I mean, how is that even possible? Like, whose information is that? Like, how did it get there?
And I'll add to that. It is the SaaS apps. They generate much more data because you have many more users actually taking advantage of that. And so it's not only you have to look at it at the tenant standpoint and then the actual SaaS app provider. The tenant tends to get hacked because an administrator has given consent to an application, and it may be just a single user. The user loses their data because they gave consent to an app. But then if you're an admin, you give full access to a tenant from a SaaS, some third-party app, they get access to that data. But then just the fact it is a SaaS app and you have multiple tenants in it, and that hack occurs because an admin clicked on something on the back end for it, that also generates massive amounts of data being stolen.
Any other thoughts on that before we jump to the next question? So I know that I was just thinking, because we all, you know, the panel here, we all have the, you know, the SharePoint backgrounds, and I just thought of, you know, some of the incidents that I've seen in environments are because, you know, as in, you know, admins, exactly what you've described, Chris, is that, you know, whether on-prem or in the cloud, admins say, well, look, I don't have time to go do this. This user, they're more of a power user, I'll give you increased permissions to go and do what you need to do. And then they neglect after that's done to pull that back in. And it's, you know, so you have that kind of practice.
But we've had that for years, though. We've had
Right.
that for years. I mean, one of the first things I would always do is look at file shares. You know, historically, when you're looking at moving stuff across, you go to a file share, it's always messed up. You've got share permissions, you've got NTFS permissions, and people were always granted, in the majority of cases, higher permissions than they actually needed. And then you always have accounts that should have been disabled, that were never disabled, that still have access to the content. And then what did we do? We picked all that stuff up and dumped it in a collaboration SaaS model somewhere. We didn't fix it. We just put the stuff in the same place and just went, ta-da! You know,
And that's an important point, because especially in light of a lot of these regulations, right, where retention policies now are being much more enforced in different industries, the looming GDPR coming up in Europe, I think this is a great opportunity to say, hey, look, you know what? We cannot have this hoarding mentality already. Like, what's the point of keeping this 10-year archive of file shares, and you can't tell me just in case I need it? I think it's incumbent upon us, first and foremost, before we think about moving into Office 365 or any SaaS platform, you know, have a reality check and say, okay, how much of this do we need? First, we look at, if retention policy says we can only keep it 5 years, anything past 5 years, sit with the business and figure out what to get rid of. And then for the things that we want to keep, truly keep, do an analysis of, okay, what do we need to protect? We can't protect them all. What are our crown jewels? You know, in the industry, they call it, what's your controlled workload? And then focus on things we need to protect first, because we can't just have a blanket statement and say, all right, for all the things we're working on, we're going to move, we're going to protect all of them. It's not realistic. We have to focus on, is it your IP? Is it PII? Is it anything that relates to financial data because of Sarbanes-Oxley, right? So we have to be methodical about this, and then it's not a one-time event. This has to be a constant enforcement, and that's where technology can come in. And Microsoft has been investing a lot in these tools to enforce a lot of these good data governance and discipline when working with data.
You know, there's this whole theme that came out around, from the migration vendors years ago around doing the pre-migration analysis, because we all, learned that, getting ready to go in and move between to restructure your farm for on-prem or move to the cloud or move to the next version, all of those things that you would go and run this or if you just try to do a migration straight through and it's failing in different areas and you're wondering why. I'm using this as an example, but the point there is that I think what you just made is needing to go through and look on a regular basis and do that analysis. It's not just about migration. It's not a, workload.
And Christian, to be frank and honest, while all these assessment tools, pre-migration tools are great, I mean, Microsoft has one, but the reality is it tells you you have so much data, you have these much SharePoint sites, these much customization, but what ends up happening? I mean, if we really, to be honest with ourselves, everything still gets moved because the business said so. Right. The challenge is IT doesn't have proper guidance and techniques to say, you know what, business, I'm not fighting with you. Let me sit down because I need to educate you. We're bounded by this retention where GDPR is coming and I'm here helping you out so we won't get in trouble, right? So that piece never doesn't happen. It's always, oh, get rid of stuff. And then the business will be so defensive. No, I'm not going to get rid of my stuff. But there's not that dialogue to say why you need to get rid of this stuff. And then once you decide what you want to keep, have a dialogue again on how we're going to protect which one's more important. Not everything can be important, right? So those conversations oftentimes doesn't happen because there's also that reality of, well, we don't have enough time. You know what? We need to move tomorrow. Well, let's just move everything, and once we're there, we'll clean it up, which never happens.
Well, here's the next question, which is how all this stuff is just going to be resolved and cleaned up without us having to lift a finger, is because AI is going to do it all, right? So
yes, indeed.
So how is AI, how is machine learning going to change this space? How is it going to improve security?
So if we look at the artificial intelligence and machine learning piece, the biggest investments that have been made, not just with Microsoft, but across the board with most security vendors and things right now, is they're trying to move away from you having to be the roadblock, I suppose, from being able to determine security events and activities and things that have took place in your environment. And the reason they're able to do this is by using algorithms that constantly look for specific types of attacks, specific events. So for example, if we look inside if you take the Microsoft 365 cloud, you have tools available there that are constantly inspecting, even down to something as simple as, for example, Chris logs into 365. The moment he logs in, it starts to build a picture of what becomes his normal behavior within Microsoft 365. Then he comes to work on a Friday, decides he's going to download 400,000 documents. That's completely unusual. I mean, actually for Chris, that might be normal, but download that many files, it'll flag it straight away. And there's no one needs to be involved in that. It's just a setting that says, I'm going to sit here and learn. So it's almost becoming an extra set of eyes for the security and the IT teams. And it's just a matter of turning those features on and allowing it to do its job. And Microsoft has a great capability, but so do lots of other vendors. I mean, there's lots in this space.
Yeah, I'll add to that the intelligent security graph for Azure AD. When you're logging into that, all of the eventing that's occurring is going into a graph where the more people that use Azure AD, the more applications, the smarter and more secure it actually is getting, because it is able to see that an attack is occurring in one tenant. It can then adapt and make sure that that attack doesn't continue on to other tenants, and possibly even preempt and warn you that high risk sign-ins are about to occur in your environment. So that's a pretty big deal.
Until it takes over and then locks us all out.
Skynet. Yeah,
Skynet. That's
I
right.
changed from the Matrix over.
Yeah, that's right. Change it to
Yeah,
Skynet.
Terminator.
But this specific topic is slated. If you read any of the security stuff that came out towards the back end of last year, this is where it's at over the next year. This is where security vendors are investing all of their money into machine learning, artificial intelligence, to mitigate a lot of the risks that historically would have been fixed. And this is kind of their idea, is if we can remove the need for someone to do it and have an automated system that can at least catch 99% of those attacks that would take place, then that stat that we showed of the proactive checks goes away, because it's an extra body. Even though it's not a physical person, it's an extra body that's going through and taking that role away, still allowing you to intervene and do what you need to, but it's now proactively doing that. And then you become the remediation, or in fact, the remediation activities are done in the same process, which is even better. I mean, Chris talked about the Azure AD type piece. It's great. I mean, a simple rule, you do what's called the impossible logon. I log in from here in Virginia, and then 30 seconds later, I log in from China. Now, we all know that that's actually feasible, because I could remote desktop to something in China, but it's technically an impossible logon. So it could flag that if I have, and this is something we'll talk about in a bit, if we have the right licensing, then I can instantly disable the account in Office 365 if it's there, and also Azure AD. Like Dux wouldn't have to do anything at that point. If Dux was in charge of the IT, there's nothing he has to do. It would notify him and tell him. He would have helped create and define those rules, but it just does it. So there's this automated protection that this is where the world's going to go to.
I know, Chris, were you going to respond to that? There's a question that was asked.
I am. I accidentally pushed that. I'll answer it, Paul, there.
Okay. I was just going to say that this, to some degree, into the next question, I'm going to roll over to this. I think we could still, of course, talk about AI, machine learning as part of this. Next question here, though, is there's another study that's part of the secondary research. 76% of respondents admit that security is brought in too late as they go through this digital transformation. So Dux, kind of to your earlier point in saying that, hey, it's not enough just to go and do an analysis of what's out there. It's what you then go and do, the actions that you take around that. And I would argue that a big piece of digital transformation, of course, we've got these platitudes out there of what that means, and this buzzword, this phrase that, what does it actually mean for our organization? Part of that, I mean, there's the technology piece of that and leveraging that capability to streamline and automate and cut costs and all those kinds of things, but is going back and looking at fundamentally, how we're doing this. What are these business processes? How are we leveraging technology or not leveraging it today? What data is being captured? Are we compliant? Are we secure? All of those things should be part of that discussion. Whether they are or not is part of a digital transformation that a business is going through, or if their companies are labeling it digital transformation and then just rolling out new technology and not changing all of their bad habits. I don't know, what's your guys' experience, your thoughts about that?
So one of the big disconnect, and while digital transformation is great, every company has to go through this to succeed and thrive in this new world, is the fundamental model of IT. Because there's still a lot of organizations where IT is very siloed. It's like, oh, I'm the collaboration guy, I'm the SharePoint person, you're the security person, you're the database person, right? And it's your job. But we all know in this new world, it doesn't work. And hence, we're taking this old models of thinking on how we roll out technology, implement technology, and applying it to this new world and new set of technologies. We like it or not, even though I'm a Office 365, SharePoint IT pro, I would need to know some level of security technologies or an understanding how it impacts my data. In the same token, our security people who sets up AD or AAD would have to have a good understanding of things like Office 365 groups, right? Because it's not a matter of setting the right security group anymore. What's the behavior of Office 365 group if we start doing guest access, or the behavior of sharing specific things in Teams versus the permissions in SharePoint, or the security trimming permissions in Teams is totally different than SharePoint. So I think this is one of the major issues, is the idea that, oh, the security people take care of it, the mail people take care of it, the SharePoint people take care of their piece. It just doesn't work that way anymore. And hence this disconnect.
I think it goes one step further as well, is the reason it's often brought up late. You can kind of illustrate it by how many organizations that are using something like Microsoft 365 have actually implemented multi-factor authentication protection on their accounts for the individuals that log in. And as I've gone across and seen many organizations, they don't do that. And it's not because they can't do it, it's because it's the differentiation between, I want it to be secure, but I also need it to be easy for my end users. And so often security gets left off the table to what it should be, because the end users are either not ready for that or they struggle with that. I mean, a simple fact, you want to do multi-factor authentication, you need to have some kind of device or phone or whatever else to make that happen. Not every person is going to have that. And so every time you log in, I mean, so we have it here. We have Office 365 and it uses multi-factor auth. You know what? The end user experience for me is very, very painful, because I have to log in. It's once I've logged in, it sends me a text. Then I open up Teams and it logs in, it sends me a text. Then I open up Skype for Business and it logs in, it sometimes sends me a text. And I'm now doing this multiple times. So what happens, we tend to find that unless it's done, unless that's done up front and people get used to using it, it never gets retrofitted. So the digital transformation piece of the content gets done, like you were saying, Dux, but the security never gets wrapped around it properly, because there isn't an easy answer. Like, nobody wants to accept the fact that they have to change the way that they've authenticated and secured stuff from what they like and what they find easy.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I blame it on freemium. The old term SaaS models, they draw you in, they get you addicted, and you get everybody, you add users, all the users are now using it, and then all of a sudden you realize, oh, there's a settings page and I have to go configure everything you just said, Liam. And then once they're actually using it, if you start to lock it down, they're going to revolt, and then all of a sudden now they're not so happy with you. It's a great app, SaaS app, but you just locked it down and now they're not happy with you. So
that's a failure of not following like a sound, just like practice around piloting new technology and looking at these changes. And then at the end of that, I mean, a pilot has the beginning, middle, and end, and then you review that and you say, well, what is the best way for us to go and do, and ask all those questions. And, look, having run, governance boards in tech companies, and sitting there and having the various owners of these different areas, having the security people, the IT team all there, having end users and management represented, and asking these kinds of questions where it may be green light, green light, green light. Somebody says, wait a second, major issue here, which could, throttle the entire, effort, versus somebody starts using it. I guess we need to support this now. And it's, there's not enough time and introspection on what we've gone out and looked at, and what this actually means as far as impact. I don't like Waldeck. I mean, because this is something, as you talk with customers, I know that are going through this, this transformation. You have products that are helping them, identify and to find code that is secure and able to run these scenarios. Are you also seeing, from your perspective, this disconnect of not spending enough time and looking at and being concerned about the security aspects of the things that they're going and doing?
Absolutely. And I guess that the funny thing is, the interesting thing is that people spend a lot of cash and effort on securing their environments. But then they will allow on their intranet a widget that they pull in from internet. And that goes even way beyond, or it doesn't even come close to the advanced analysis that we offer, but just the fact that they have a widget that shows, I don't know, stock info, the weather, doesn't matter. That widget is a part of scripts that runs on their page. That script can do whatever the user that comes to that page is allowed to, because that script is just a part of the page. So it has the same security context as the user being on a page. Now, if that person happens to be CEO, HR manager, or admin, well, guess what? Suddenly, the widget that shows the weather has access to all your confidential stuff, no matter if you're on-prem or online, no matter if you have RSA tokens, VPN, whatever, because it can always call out. So unless you monitor that, I mean, it runs in browser, right? So you would really have to think through like how you would block that, because it's hard to distinguish from just a regular user going to a website. So it's just a piece of script that can suddenly call out to internet, sharing all of your internal stuff that you work so hard to protect, right? So the surprising thing is that's been a change that's been going on for the last few years. Like a few years back more, we used to build code that would run on servers, right? And the risk was clear. If the code was poor, your server would be brought down. Now we build scripts that run in browsers, and people are like, brilliant, right? Because that has no effect on your servers, on your farms, right? So you don't have to worry about things like the uptime or breaking the farm. But the risk is even more, right? Because nowadays people tend to pull in random stuff from the internet that nobody reviews that have full privileges to your data. So I would say that with this shift, this big change towards using more out of the box, less server on or less code on servers, we create maybe even bigger risk, because we tend to reuse more than to build ourselves. We don't review what we pull in, and we don't restrict it in a way that it runs.
Electron apps.
Yeah.
For example.
I said, well, but Waldeck, that app was the highly rated and came up very high in the organic search results. So I just
Totally.
assumed it was safe.
Absolutely. I mean,
Awesome.
yeah, that's probably the easiest thing to do, right? Just to say, because there are a few hundred other folks who use it, I'm going to do because it's safe, right? Because there's a few hundred other folks who use it, and guess what? These few hundred other folks think exactly the same. Because there are a few hundred other folks, I'm going to use it too, right? And with that, that whole group of folks become sheep that one follows another, and like nobody really thinks through like what is exactly the risk that thing might introduce to my environment.
I mean, they've been around for a while. I always used to find it funny. So one of the things I wrote many years ago was the claims viewer web part that was free. And I just posted it and said, hey, I got the claims viewer web part. It still surprises me how many environments that I get to look at, and they've installed that. Now, I wrote it. I mean, that should warn you anyway that you should check the code. But I would ask the question and just say, hey, you've got the web part that I wrote. They'd be like, oh, yeah, it's great. I'm like, did you check the code? Well, no. Well, but why not? It's like, well, you wrote it. I would check it. I would check it just to make sure. But it would be in a production environment. And so, like, we haven't moved past what used to happen previously. You know, it's like Waldeck, you were saying, you know, we've moved to this browser model now, so we think we're okay. In actual fact, that doesn't change anything. We still have the exact same problems, exact same issues, except we've moved the attack surface to be somewhere else. And in actual fact, we've hidden the attack surface now, because it's much harder for us to go and look at a minified piece of JavaScript and figure out what it's doing. You know, it's like, oh, it's calling out. What's it doing? I have no idea. I mean, those of us that have ever tried to unminify and look at a piece of JavaScript, it's very painful.
You know, I was going to kind of transition us into the next question, which was not very serious. Maybe I'll modify this instead of just anybody want to share a security breach story. I'll modify that, saying that was due to a code or a tool that Liam built.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. That's it now.
I think somebody's testifying in front of Congress right now about
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right.
So this was yeah, I know that, and you know, I'm sure there's a lot of, you know, fun stories, and I was just pointing somebody to your one of Liam, your old video. I went looking for it for the so you think you can hack SharePoint videos. Very entertaining videos out there. But matter of time, I want to jump to the next one because I think this speaks to, we've talked back and forth around this, about the move to the cloud services and where organizations have been largely on-prem and now moving towards hybrid and pure cloud solutions. There's been this shift away from customizing everything. I mean, in SharePoint, there was a name, they were called like the Swiss Army knife platform, but to go and customize everything. And a lot of times organizations were not even fully aware of what the out-of-the-box capabilities were. They just assumed I've got to go in to make it do what I want it to do. I mean, how do you see this broadly looking across Microsoft Cloud services, this issue of customization? How are you addressing this? What do the conversations sound like with customers now about, you know, how customizations and how they handle that, what they've done historically, impacts their security planning going forward? Everybody all at the same time.
I think I'll take it from an opposite standpoint. If you stay with the out of the box, because it's a SaaS model, especially Office 365, anytime you do a SaaS model and you stay with out of the box and they make a change to it and they don't educate it, you don't have pop-ups and you don't know where that link went, you don't know how to now go find your list settings, library settings, that's very frustrating. So I would take the opposite stance of saying the reason you would have customizations is so that you avoid that problem. And the only time you would, want to say, I trust you to go with your UI, to go with the out of box, is if you 100% of the time provide coverage to say, where did that thing go? That's my stance on that.
But I guess so, to match that, in a way, there's a distinction in 365 where you can have targeted release to users and you can have your production group, right? So with that gives you a heads up call to what's going to come. And that allows you to prepare a bit in advance. Like, these are the things that are going to come. But yeah, it still requires a conscious effort to keep track on that, right? Because sure, there is a roadmap, there are the announcements, but then somebody has to monitor that and read those emails and announcements and then act on them, right? But I guess that the biggest change is that I see is that in the past, while we used to write code that would run on farms, we tended to pull in fewer things that were not built within the company, or they would come from a vendor, right? And I'm not saying that that's less or that that's more secure, but at least you could have a relationship with that other side. Nowadays, we just tend to pull things from internet, from Liam, and we have no idea who's building that, who's monitoring that, what review was. We don't even know what code exactly is in there, right? So I guess that the biggest part is that the customers, I think that while they're going through the change, they don't realize the change, that the way they customize stuff with scripts in browser, that doesn't solve the problem. Well, it solves the problem that they have in the past, but it doesn't solve the problem as such. They still need to do work. They just need to do it in another area. And that's the one thing that many customers are unaware of, right? Because things change. Cheese has been moved, but they're still thinking in that old model where code would belong to a farm, and now that code isn't there, so problem is gone. Well, no, or really, it's just in a different place.
I think it goes one step further as well, because it's still, I mean, historically, we should have done security planning when we wrote full trust solutions as well. I mean, that's what should have happened. And in some instances, I would see that would get done. And in other times, everything just ran as elevated because they were trying to get round Well, I don't want to give the individual users access to everything. So their security planning was make it run as elevated. I mean, that was the fix, and I'm sure you've seen your fair share of that code too, Waldeck. And
Yeah,
I'm sure,
absolutely.
yeah, and I'm sure Chris has done the same. I mean, maybe Christian's been writing code too, but I somehow doubt that.
I will not say where
That's where all the problems are coming from. If we want to
Yeah.
go
I'm
there.
gonna say Christian's under a different name. He just writes all the code that everybody steals off GitHub now.
I go by Liam. That's right.
Yeah. But then now from the client customizations, it's like you said, that security planning still doesn't get done because you think, well, think about it. The only way to get into Office 365 is what? An authentication. So I have to have an Azure AD token somehow to get in, to be able to run whatever it is. It's not like it's anonymous, which we could have done on premises. So because we authenticate, that's the problem. We think we're okay because to get to it, you have to authenticate in the first place. But that's the problem because like Waldeck was saying, once you're authenticated, then I can have the code do whatever it needs to do. And so that planning doesn't take place. Whenever I do a review and audit, the first question I ask is, can you explain to me the authentication flows and user traversal of the site that they're going to? And they're like, well, what do you mean? I was like, well, how do they get in? When do they come in? Why are they there? And what are they supposed to be doing? And then which customizations do you have that follow that path? And 9 times out of 10, no one knows. They just know that we authenticate and then we're in, but they don't know what else happens. And so for me, that's a big piece that's been missing for a long time.
And I guess and I guess that it also grows, right? Because originally we would have access only to lists and documents.
Mm-hmm.
And nowadays, we also get the ability to access the Microsoft Graph, which exposes way more info like personal email, personal calendar, planner, Teams access, groups access. So if all of that is exposed, I mean, you might want to because there's a business requirement that says, when I come to my intranet, I want to be able to see my upcoming events, right? So for that, you need to grant access to scripts to be able to access the Microsoft Graph and calendar. But with that, like widget web part on your intranet or a web part that shows the weather might have access to your events and even email, right? So if you open up these APIs for valid reasons, you have to keep in mind that you're opening them to everybody, to every single script that runs in your tenant. And nowadays, when you build your script on SPFX in modern way, well, that's locked down, right? Because they have to go through admin approval. But in the past, on classic sites, every user who was allowed to edit a page and add a web part, they could embed a piece of script, and that piece of script would exactly have even the same access to Microsoft Graph, right? So you really have to think through when you open up these APIs that they're going to be available across your whole tenant, across every single piece of script that runs across the board, not just one particular web part.
And I think you just started answering, Waldeck, the next question there is you think about what the efforts that Microsoft is doing, and part of the reason for this question too is because and Liam, you authored the white paper around this and looking at the research data and the responses, and it's not enough just to go and talk about, well, hey, this is what surveys tell us, and here's what's happening that's out there. The point of this is then to say, well, where are the gaps? What are people missing in their planning process and providing that guidance? So I ask everybody here, and we've got a few minutes left here, and one other question I want to get to, but kind of where are customers falling short in their planning?
I'll say real quick, PAW machines, privileged access workstations, they don't implement those. They're not implementing just-in-time access, and they're not implementing runbooks based off alerts and security logs that come off their Azure instances. Those are 3 areas for me that people don't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
For me, Christian, I would want to step back and say just the clarity and guidance from Microsoft. While there's a lot of improvements, but the messaging is all separate and siloed, right?
Yeah.
So when I talk to customers, like people don't really get the difference between DLP and CASB and RMS. And then while Azure information protection is great, I mean, the other day I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, if I have E5, do I get AIP? Actually, I don't. I only get RMS.
Right.
I get advanced information protection. I don't get Azure information protection. And then if I want Azure information protection that does labeling and classification, there's P1 and P2. So it's just all these different nuances, but not having a streamlined messaging guidance for customer to say, here's what you should be doing. Here's what you should be turning on and not turning. I mean, all
Right.
this is great, but the awareness and education and guidance is not there.
Yeah, it's not just customers, it's partners too. So they don't know what to sell. When you say E3, E5 license, you're talking Office 365, but then there's EMS E3, E5.
Correct. And then there's M365, right? Where you get
that.
AIP, P1, P2 as well.
Partners are just confused on that.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because that flows into basically the research that came out. I kind of went into this with Christian and we talked about this in the beginning, and I kind of expected certain types of responses and answers to come back from the research based on my own experience of working with clients and going through the process. And sure enough, it came back to back up those things, which is all to do with that Microsoft have done a good job. They have some great tools, but as I've worked on specific clients that have had Office 365 breaches, it's not that they didn't necessarily know that it was there because they can read the documentation. In all fairness, this is the first time ever that I'm going to stand by this, that Microsoft have actually wrote really good documentation on time when stuff gets released versus playing catch up for months afterwards and you don't know what to do with it. They've done a great job, but the problem is those things that you need come at an extra cost over and above the licenses that most organizations have.
Correct.
And even though it might be, so I worked with a client, they've got 10,000 users, they're all working perfectly great, everything's good, they're in 365, they're using Teams and groups and everything you want to. And what they do is they cross-charge the license fees to the departments. So for example, IT buys all the E3 licenses, they go to HR and say, hey, 15 people, we're going to bill you this much annually for your licensing. IT came back and said, we really need to have cloud app security and some of those components. It's only a couple of dollars per user, nothing special. But when you've got 10,000 of them, that's significantly more than $2. And so they go to the HR department of 15 people and say, it's now going to cost you an extra $2 per person, 15 times 2, nothing spectacular, per person. They came back and said, well, what do I get for that? And in the answer, it realistically for the business user is nothing, because that isn't a service for them. That's a service for IT and security to manage. The end user should feel happy and comfortable that they've got some extra protection, but they ended up having a battle between the two because it was like, well, I don't want to pay the extra money because you're not giving me anything that I want. Whereas IT is saying, well, no, we actually need to have this. And so there's this long battle that goes ahead. And this is where the falling is, because you're trying to retrospectively add things in at extra cost and nobody knows which ones to buy. Is it E5? Is it E5 plus EMS plus security? Is it this? Is it that? There's still no clear definition.
Well, we had that difficulty at the beginning when Office 365, before it was rebranded as Office 365, and writing that early licensing, nobody wanted to see or talk about the fully weighted cost of the service that we're providing, because we thought no one's going to want to pay for that. We want to be able to go out there and say, hey, $2 a user a month and $4 a user. Like, yeah, but if that cost, this is what the actual cost is. It's like going in, like our salaries. It's you work for a company. There's the amount that you receive, and then there's the cost with everything that's in the back end, the fully weighted cost of that. And we have to understand what those costs are around security. We can't, and I'm agree with you guys. I mean, it's confusing. I wrote a note. I thought, like, I've got to reach out to Matt Wade about his periodic table. Like, he's got to be able to go and kind of filter it, not just on licensing, but on the security impacts.
So Christian, this goes back to the point, what do we really want to protect, right? Because security is such a broad word. Fine, you can spend all your money, buy all these fancy security tools, but if it's not, if you don't need all that, right? And I think that's a gap. People don't sit down, organizations don't really talk about what do we need to protect. If it's just, hey, look, we just need a better way to classify and automate classification, then yeah, AIP is needed. But if that's not a need, then we don't need AIP. Or maybe Office 365 Compliance Center would suffice with E5, right? It has some level of DLP, whereas E3, you don't get it. So that conversation, just saying we need security, ergo we need to pay for all these more expensive SKU, it doesn't cut it. Cost certainly is one thing, but then the conversation around what do we need to protect has to happen.
Agreed. Yeah, it is very complex, and that's why understanding what your business goals are, what you're trying to accomplish with the technology, plays into that. If you don't have a firm understanding of what that is, you're just deploying a piece of technology. We need to collaborate more. Then you're not going to be able to have those conversations and answer that because you've not really thought through how this is benefiting your business. That's part of that, I would argue, digital transformation discussion, which could be a trimming of technology down to what is core needed for those workloads and business processes. And we've just got a couple of minutes left here, and with two questions, I did want to ask about, because so much of this we've historically had around the governance question. Is it something you're still talking with customers about, how they manage these things proactively?
100%. The problem is the word governance is so big, people don't know how to wrap their heads around it. I speak with customers and people around it from a perspective of three things, right? Governance around provisioning of containers where data will be stored. So OneDrive is a container, SharePoint's a container, Teams is a container. So what's your governance around provisioning? Second, what's your governance around operational management? So once you have your SharePoint site, right, what's your governance around people creating subsites, managing permissions, whatnot? So that's operational governance or operational management, governance around operational management. The third piece, which a lot of people don't even think about, is what's your governance around the information lifecycle, end of life, right? So let's say you stick something in a SharePoint site or a Teams, and once that project is done, what happens to it? What's your governance around it? Does it just sit there? So by bucketing into that three categories and how people think about securing and governing their data, I think makes it more palatable. And then we can look at, okay, what are the approaches and technologies we can leverage to make sure it's governed to the level we need it to be.
I'll simply add, I don't even really use the word governance anymore. I've switched over to just saying compliance. It's easier. They tend to be more responsive to the word compliance these days.
It's a made-up word anyway.
Totally.
Oh no, I said that out loud. Sorry. No, but it is important. So, when it comes to governance, I talk to clients about it too. What I do like is I've worked with clients in the past that I think have this right, where they have the governance committee and they discuss and bring things together, and it involves more than just IT. It's people from various business units come together, they discuss a new security component, or they discuss a new feature, and then based on that meeting it determines whether new features get rolled out. That's the true type of governance where there's a team that's kind of managing that, and that seems to work really well for some of the clients that I've worked with that do that. It allows them to kind of have a different perspective on things, because often I tend to find that IT is pretty heavy on, I want the new shiny, the new exciting, the everything else, but the business users just really want to do their job and just have a nice way of doing it. So it's the nice balance of the two, bring them together. And when we talk about security, that is the only way of doing it. Like IT would want everything. Like I use a real world one. In my house, I want to block everything. I want to lock everybody down so they can't do anything. But in reality, that's just silly. Because I need to use it too. But I want to put protections in place that protect my children and my family, but also give them the freedoms to kind of do what they need to for school. And so you face this battle in my own house of that thing together. And so it's working out and saying, well, what do we need to do? It goes back to what Dux keeps going back to. What is it you're trying to secure? What is it you're trying to protect? And when I look at my own house, I'm trying to protect my kids from certain things. I'm trying to protect so people don't come in. And so I don't need to go crazy. I need to choose the things that need to be done now and put them in place. And if I need to add, then I add. But it's a conversation. I have to go through this in my own family. I'm sure you guys do too. That's the way we do things. It should be the same model that we follow.
Well, if I could just, so final question here, maybe get a quick response from each one of you of, like one thing you feel like you're a broken record on this point, but, what should people, ensure as part of their planning process? Like, what do you feel like you're reminding customers about all the time? And why don't we start with Waldeck?
So to add a bucket to the three named by Ducks, whatever you build, think about the way you build it, think about technology. Because in the past, there was one way of doing things. Nowadays, 100 ways. And when you build things one way and there's nobody else in your company who can support that, that's going to cost you way more along the road, right? So think through and have a ready-to-use plan for everything that you want to customize and extend in SharePoint.
And Chris?
So I would say, I already said it once, PAW machines, privileged access workstations, just the concept of it, implementing in Azure and anything else you do. Just-in-time access is a big pattern nowadays. So being able to turn on rules that allow you to access for a certain period of time for your IP, huge. People don't use that. App consent reviews. When you go in, you have SaaS apps and people are just clicking, users and admins, adding permissions that allow those apps to call in, get tokens to be able to do actions as you or as the admin. If you're not reviewing your app consents, that's a big problem. Multi-factor auth, less than 20% of the tenant admins across all of Azure actually have MFA turned on. Huge problem. If you're not using MFA, that's major. And then if you're in Europe, GDPR data subject, what I call the data subject action pattern, you need to be able to support what I call the actions of notify, verify, search, update, delete, and hold across all of your apps that hold user data. And if you can't do that, that's a problem. You need to put that in your action plan.
Awesome. And Liam?
I think for me, the thing that I tend to talk most about or have most conversations is, it goes back to what we talked about to do with licensing, is that in your security action plan, it's a review of licensing, a review of the features mapped to the licenses, and then an agreement of what those would be. And that should be something that should be done very early on, is to determine, what features should be used, and security and IT should go away and come back and say, this is what we want. And the business should say, well, this is what we want. And then there should be a coming together where we marry those together and work out what that cost is going to look like. And then that's what happens. That becomes the premise for all the security features, along with mapping out the roadmap of when things will come in. Because we do want to have multi-factor in some instance. We do want to have, cloud app security capabilities in whatever cloud service we use. We do want to have the proactive reporting and tools at some point, but working that through. So figuring out the licensing, making sure there's agreement on cost, and then working out what the roadmap for those features to come should be on that security action plan.
Okay. And to wrap us up, Ducks?
Yeah, so for me, it's that thinking around how do you constantly enforce a lot of these security policies, right? So take advantage of technologies and tools to automate this, because I believe at the end of the day, people are not malicious. People are not intentional in not following these policies. So if we can make it easy enough and simple enough, making it easy for people to do the right thing on a regular basis, I think that's the way to go, that people should include in their action plan.
Got to make it simple enough for Liam to be able to follow it.
Right. That's right.
Correct. If I can follow it through, it's good.
That's right. Well, we're out of time here. I know that if anybody who's still watching this, has questions, you can reach out to us individually. Of course, you can send them to me, and I can relay that to the team. And we're going to be doing, I'm sure, some other blog content and things around this. I do want to point people towards the report that is out as of today. Please download, take a look at it. We're going to be promoting this. It's going to, you'll be able to get this from Rencor, Soliance, and AvePoint, from today forward. So you visit each of those. Will be, as I have the links for all these, I'll be pushing them out through social. But definitely download a copy. Send us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And then, finally, just want to share this from on behalf of the Rencor team. The next webinar around provisioning and customizing modern team sites in SharePoint Online with Hugh Wood. So looking forward to that. And gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the panel discussion today. Thanks a lot for your time, and thanks to everybody that attended. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.